The United States and Israel have launched major strikes on Iran on Saturday, with President Donald Trump confirming major combat operations are now underway and urging Iranians to rise up against their government. Explosions have been reported across Tehran and at key nuclear sites, including Fordow and Natanz and Isfahan, while Israel says Iran has retaliated with missile fire and regional tensions are rapidly escalating, including reported strikes near the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet base in Bahrain. Now, with internet blackouts inside Iran, cyber attacks on state media, and nuclear diplomacy appearing to collapse, the Middle East is bracing for what could become a far wider conflict. We're now joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin, for more analysis. Good to have you on TVP World. So let's get right into this. Escalation ladder here. I mean, we've covered this before. We talked about this many times before, but now it's happening. Where does this escalation ladder go in your mind? Is this more proxy strikes? Is this something more direct? Where does this go in the next few hours?
Well, let's assess where we are, and that is that the strikes, not just by Israel, but by the United States, are aiming at regime change. That goes beyond what happened last June. The Americans said at that point they didn't want to change the regime. But this time, there's an attempt not only to hit military targets, such as Iran's Revolutionary Guards, but also targeted assassinations of the supreme leader, of Iran's president, of other senior officials. An Israeli official indeed is claiming that in the waves of strikes this morning, that the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guards has been killed, Iran's defense minister has been killed, the head of Iranian intelligence services has been killed. The Iranians themselves have not confirmed that. But simply trying to do this expands the scope of this assault. And therefore, the Iranians have retaliated this time, not just by firing back at Israel, and there have been some missiles already fired, but they have also fired on American positions, these bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and in Qatar. We haven't got any reports of American casualties, but last June, the Iranians did not even fire on an American base until the end of Israel's 12-day war, and then they only did it as a demonstration strike because they warned the Americans, look, we don't really want this to expand. And Donald Trump went to Benjamin Netanyahu and said, stop. This time, there's no stopping, at least at this point. The Trump administration of Israel have made it clear they want to get rid of the regime. The regime has made clear that this time they're going to fight back, not just against Israel, but against other positions in the region.
Also, let's look at the international reaction. We've heard calls on the European side, some European Commission, maybe no surprise, for restraint. At the same time, we have other allies in the West, including Giorgia Meloni of Italy, saying she supports the Iranian people. The head of the Czech government saying he supports what Trump is doing. So what is that, let's say, Western response in all this? What's next? Is that going to change? There's also the EU Red Sea maritime fleet close by. There are French forces also in the Gulf. How much of a risk factor is this for escalating? What's the international response here to all this?
Well, there's a risk to everyone, including European personnel. But that reaction you mentioned across Europe is interesting in terms of different degrees here. The only all-out support that I know of is the Czech president, Mr. Babiš, for the strikes. Giorgia Meloni in Italy is saying, well, I support the Iranian people. That's very different from supporting U.S. and Israeli airstrikes that might kill Iranian people. And then you have the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who's calling for de-escalation. Everybody step back. Perhaps the most interesting reaction is from the UK, once the U.S.'s closest ally. The UK has not only stepped away from this and not supported this, they're saying this is a violation of international law. There's no justification. Now, that's a pretty strident rebuke. I have to say at this point that I think the U.S. and Israel are largely on their own here. I think if the Iranian regime does not fall soon, in other words, if you don't have this supposed closure that the regime is gone, other Iranians can take power, that you're going to find sort of an international wave which says, look, this needs to stop, even if there's very little they can do at this point to check the Israelis and the Americans.
Also, let's talk about the Iranian people here. We've seen them suffer through this as well before. I know you and I, we talked about this in the past as well, those terrible, those actions, the crackdowns against people. I know several thousand dead not so long ago. I mean, you were on the ground in Iran some years ago. How do they play into this? I mean, this call by President Trump saying this is your hour of freedom, how much are they part of this and that change that, well, at least that Trump and the Israelis want?
No, I mean, I haven't been inside Iran since the 2009 mass protest against the rigged presidential election, because simply told, if I went back, I was told I'd be put in prison. But I still have many, many Iranian friends there, many, many Iranian colleagues. And a lot of them do not like this regime. A lot of them would want a change in regime or at least sweeping reforms for political, social, economic space and progress. But at the same time, once you have the US and Israel trying to kill the leaders of the regime will go back to the Iranian people and say, look, whatever you think of us, your nation is being attacked. You're under assault. And what we saw last June is that when Israel went in with the 12-day war supported by the United States, and they killed many senior military commanders, they tried to kill the political leaders, the regime was able to call on Iranians to protest against those strikes. So I have to say that any idea, if it is genuinely held by the Trump camp and by the Netanyahu government, that these strikes simply will lead to an Iranian rising to get rid of the regime, I have to say that that's probably a very, very risky and perhaps foolhardy assessment. And indeed, it does issue a reminder of what happened in Iran's neighbor, Iraq, in 2003.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Iraq there, and I think this is a good point to peg this. The makeup of Iran ethnically is also complex. If we're looking at different groups throughout the country, it's a big country. If we're looking also at the northwest, very much a Kurdish population there. How much does that factor into all of this? Is there unity? How much is this going to impact pressure on the regime, or how will this be used? What comes next?
Yeah, you have layer upon layer in Iranian society that although about 95% of the population is Shia Muslim, that you have the Kurdish ethnic population, you have the Azeri ethnic population up in the northwest, you have an Arab population in the south, and the Iranian regime has not been kind to many of those minorities, which is why last month's protests, when they were brutally repressed, you saw a lot of ethnic minorities that were at the lead of those, and they took the first blows. Now, again, in Iran, where you're talking about support of political and social rights, these groups are really important. But their ability to stand against the regime is challenged not only by the scale of the repression that we've seen, it is challenged by the narrative being taken over by an assault by the United States and by Israel, because Iran has a long history of attempts to change its regime or its government. We know the US and Britain did this in 1953. We know that the Shah, which was propped up by the United States, that Iranians remember that in the 1970s. So all of these social, political, and ethnic issues kind of just get buried by the headline of US and Israel attack.
Mm-hmm. A couple more quick questions. I want to ask you many more, but I'm limited by time. We're looking also at the reaction by the international community. Let's also talk about a big player, China, also very close to the Iranian regime. The latest we've heard is, I think it was yesterday, where they warned their citizens to leave immediately. How is this all being perceived in Beijing?
Oh, Beijing will view this with concern, because you're talking about the prospect of war and instability, not just in Iran, but across the Middle East. You know, we've talked about what's already happening in the Gulf states with Iran strikes. We could talk about Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Palestine. China largely, however, will not get directly involved here. They will probably join the international community in calling for de-escalation, for everybody to step back, respect for international law, but they're not going to take sides, as it were, here. They're going to wait and see what happens. Now, should the Trump camp in Israel run into trouble, China will exploit that space. They will probably come out more forcefully in condemning the strikes and saying that there's a need for Washington to step back. But for now, they watch as well as the rest of us do, because the biggest concern here is simply that this confrontation expands.
I mean, right now we're dealing with so much information at the moment. I do want to ask, though, another key ally of the regime, Russia. Now, careful question here for you. I mean, in a way, is this has always been a strategy of Trump to go in and do this, what he's done with the Israelis? Or is this perhaps some kind of frustration with Putin and sort of acting out here in Iran? Is it maybe something else? What's the Russia angle here?
Well, I mean, I think there's multiple motives. I think the Trump folks may also be trying to divert from domestic issues. I think they have a desire for dominance in the region, which now overtakes Trump posing as president of peace. But I think there's not a Russia angle here that led to this. This was very much their decision that they were going to go in with Israel once and for all. I do think that if you talk about the wider effects on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what this does is this knocks the Ukraine-Russia-U.S. talks off to the side. Remember that Donald Trump's chief envoys, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, were trying to play at, dealing with these two crises at the same time. They had hearings on the same day about Iran as well as about Ukraine and Russia. Now that the stakes have been raised in Iran, I don't see the Trump camp being able to keep up that level of involvement in Russia and Ukraine, even though it brought us little hope of a ceasefire in the near future.
And also, I mean, we're dealing also with a lot, but curious on what does success here look like for the United States and Israel in the next few days and hours, really, and what does failure look like?
The regime collapses in the next few days, even if there's an uncertainty of who takes place, because then you no longer have the supreme leader, you no longer have the Revolutionary Guards, you no longer have even the possibility of Iran pursuing a nuclear weapon, even if they do not, I stress, do not have one at the moment. What does failure look like? The regime doesn't collapse in the next few days. It's able to continue counterattacking. Some Americans get killed in the region. And then the Trump camp in Israel gets sucked into a quagmire about how long they're going to continue this. Because remember, there's one limit on their ability to change the regime. I don't think there's any way that the Trump people repeat what happened in Iraq in 2003 and they put American troops into Iran. And if the regime is not broken and you are not putting troops on the ground into Iran, how do you expect success to occur?
Yeah, so very, very different scenarios, and we'll be, of course, covering this throughout the days and hours ahead. Look, thanks so much. Always a pleasure having you with us here. Scott Lucas there. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary throughout the day. Goodbye.